The station alarms had not stopped ringing for 11 minutes when General Marquez walked into the negotiation chamber, and I remember thinking that a species about to beg for its survival does not walk like that. My name is Alira Sen. I served as senior observer for the Ostrena Compact, a union of 11 species that had never lost a war it chose to fight. I had watched empires kneel. I had watched proud fleets surrender before a single shot was fired, simply because our numbers were too large to argue with. I came to this station expecting to watch the human species join that long list of the humbled. I did not expect what happened instead, and I have spent every day since trying to explain it to people who were not there. The chamber itself sat at the center of a neutral relay station called Corven Reach, built generations ago by a species that no longer existed, kept alive now only as a meeting ground for disputes too large for ordinary diplomacy. 12 delegations could fit around its central table. That day, only 2 did. On one side sat the full weight of the compact, 5 species deep, robes and armor and translators humming quietly behind every chair. On the other side sat 4 humans in plain gray uniforms, no decoration, no ceremony, as if they had walked in from a hallway rather than from a war. General Kess sat at the center of the human delegation, and she did not look at the compact's numbers the way I expected. She did not count us. She looked instead at the exits, at the ceiling supports, at the small service door behind the high speaker's chair, the way a person studies a room they intend to remember rather than a room they intend to fear. High Speaker Doran Vell opened the session the way he had opened 40 other sessions before it, with the practiced patience of someone who has never once lost. He reminded the humans of the border incursion 3 months prior, an incident the Compact still insisted on calling human aggression, though every independent record showed a Compact scout vessel crossing into human space first. He reminded them of the 2 colonies the Compact fleet had encircled since, not attacked, only encircled, a demonstration he called restraint. And then he laid out the terms. Human territory along the Corven frontier would be ceded within 1 cycle. Human military vessels above a certain size would be grounded and inspected. A permanent Compact observation post would be established inside human space to ensure what he called continued peaceful behavior. In exchange, the Compact would withdraw its fleets from the 2 encircled colonies and consider the matter closed. I watched the human delegation as the terms were read. 3 of the 4 barely moved. The 4th, a colonel named Edric Thorne, kept his hands flat on the table the entire time, fingers spread, as if he were holding something down rather than resting them. General Kess said nothing until the reading finished. Then she asked a single question, and it was not the question the room expected. Do you know why we stopped answering your last 3 transmissions? The high speaker paused. It was a small pause, barely long enough to notice, but I noticed it, because in 40 sessions I had never seen him pause before answering anything. He said the Compact had assumed the silence was a sign of human disorganization, perhaps internal disagreement about how to respond to Compact demands. It was, he said, one more piece of evidence that humanity was not yet ready to be treated as an equal party in matters of this scale. Kess nodded slowly, as if she had expected exactly that answer and had already decided what it told her about the people giving it. We stopped answering, she said, because we were done talking to people who mistake patience for weakness. There was no anger in her voice. That was the part I could not explain to my superiors later, no matter how many times they asked me to describe her tone. It was not the voice of someone provoked. It was the voice of someone reading a verdict that had already been decided somewhere else, in some other room, long before this meeting began. The high speaker tried to press forward with the terms again, as though the question and its answer had simply been a small interruption in the true business of the day. Kess let him finish. She let him finish because, I understood much later, she was no longer negotiating. She was simply waiting for him to stop talking so she could leave. I did not know it yet, sitting in that chamber with my translator humming against my collar. But the war that would reshape everything I believed about strength and weakness had already been decided. It had been decided months earlier, far from Corven Reach, in rooms none of us had access to, by people who had stopped believing that speeches could protect what they loved. All that remained now was for someone to say the words out loud, and General Marquez had come to this station to be the one who said them. The session was not yet over, but something in the room had already changed, and every delegate at that table, whether they admitted it to themselves or not, felt it happen. I want to tell you what came next in the order I lived it, because the order matters. It is easy, looking back, to make everything feel inevitable, to say of course the humans won. Of course we should have seen it coming. But I did not see it coming. None of us did. And I think the reason we failed to see it is the same reason so many species before us failed to understand humanity, until it was far too late to matter. We measured them by our own history, and humanity had never once fought a war the way we expected them to. The session resumed after a short recess, and it was during that second half that the true insult was spoken. The one-word choice that would later be repeated across 100 human broadcasts as proof of everything the war would come to mean. High Speaker Doran Vell, frustrated that his terms had not been accepted outright, changed his approach. He stopped speaking to General Kess and began speaking instead to the empty air above the table, the way diplomats do when they want their words recorded for a wider audience than the room contains. He said that the compact understood humanity's reluctance to accept oversight, that young species often struggled to recognize the limits of their own strength, and that humanity in particular reminded him of children playing with borrowed fire, certain of their own cleverness right up until the moment the fire stopped listening to them. The chamber went quiet in a way I had not heard it go quiet before, not the polite silence of diplomats waiting their turn, but something heavier, something that made the air itself feel thinner. Colonel Thorne's hands, still flat on the table, curled slowly into fists. He did not raise them. He did not raise his voice. But something in his jaw shifted, and I understood, watching him, that he had heard variations of this insult before, from other species, in other rooms, and that each time it had cost him something to sit still and let it pass. General Kess did not react the way I expected either of them to react. She smiled. It was small and it did not reach her eyes, and it was, I would come to learn, the smile humans wear specifically when they have decided that further argument is a waste of breath. She said that humanity did not consider itself a child, and that the compact's confusion on this point was not a failure of human understanding, but a failure of compact memory. She reminded the room that 80 years earlier, before the compact had ever heard the word human, humanity had been a single species on a single world, without allies, without a fleet capable of leaving its own solar system, entirely alone in a galaxy that had already been carved up by empires far older than itself. She said that in those 80 years, while the compact expanded through treaties and inherited territory and the slow absorption of weaker neighbors, humanity had expanded by building everything from nothing, with no one to hand them a fleet or a border or a seat at any table. She said that a species which does that in 80 years does not need the compact's permission to be called anything at all. The High Speaker tried to respond, and this is the part I remember most clearly, because it was the first time in the entire session that he sounded less certain than he had a moment before. He said that expansion without alliance was not the same as strength, that a species without partners was a species without protection, and that humanity's isolation, whatever it had produced, remained a vulnerability the compact was prepared to exploit if talks failed. General Kess let the silence stretch after that sentence longer than she had let any silence stretch before. Then she asked her second question of the day, and it was this question, more than anything spoken before it, that later analysts would point to as the true beginning of the war. She asked the High Speaker whether he had ever wondered why, in 80 years of watching humanity expand without allies, no species in this quadrant had ever successfully invaded a human world. The question hung there, and I watched 3 of the compact's 5 delegations exchange glances, because it was, I realized in that moment, a fact none of us had ever properly examined. Humanity had fought border skirmishes. Humanity had absorbed refugee waves from collapsing neighboring territories. Humanity had, on 4 separate recorded occasions, been the target of hostile incursions by smaller regional powers testing the edges of its territory. And in every one of those 4 occasions, the incursion had ended not in negotiation, not in stalemate, but in the quiet disappearance of the attacking force from compact intelligence records, with no public explanation ever offered by either side. We had always assumed those disappearances were the result of humanity's allies intervening quietly, some unnamed patron protecting a valuable frontier species from consequences it could not otherwise survive. It was the explanation that let us keep believing humanity was, at its core, still dependent on someone stronger. General Kess told us, in that chamber, in front of 11 species who believed they understood the balance of power in this quadrant better than anyone alive, that humanity had never had a patron. There had been no quiet ally stepping in to erase those attacking fleets from history. There had only been humanity, alone, doing what it had always done when threatened, and choosing afterward not to advertise the details. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer anyone who reads this account. It felt like standing on ground I had believed was solid and feeling it shift very slightly beneath my feet, Not enough to fall, but enough to know, for the first time, that it could. The high speaker recovered his composure faster than I expected. He said that unverified claims were not evidence, that the compact would not restructure 80 years of strategic assessment based on the word of a general with an interest in appearing formidable, and that the terms on the table remained the terms on the table, regardless of what stories humanity chose to tell about its own history. Kess did not argue the point further. She simply said that the compact was welcome to test the claim directly, and that humanity would not object to the compact learning the truth the same way its previous 4 neighbors had learned it. It was said quietly. It was said, if anything, almost gently, the way a person might warn a stranger about ice on a path, rather than threaten them with harm. And that gentleness was, I think, what made it so unsettling. Threats are easy to dismiss. Warnings offered without malice, offered as simple fact by someone who has clearly stopped caring whether you believe them, are much harder to set aside. The session broke for a longer recess after that exchange, and during it, I did something I was not authorized to do. I requested access to the compact's full historical file on those 4 vanished incursion fleets, the ones we had always filed under insufficient data, and moved past without further question. I wanted to know, before the talks resumed, whether Kess's claim could possibly be true, or whether it was simply the kind of confident fiction that desperate delegations sometimes offer when the real numbers are against them. What I found in those files did not answer my question. It only made the question larger. Every one of those 4 incursion forces had entered human territory with full confidence, full intelligence briefings, and reasonable expectation of an easy campaign against a supposedly young and undefended frontier. Every one of them had gone silent within days of first contact. And in every case, the silence had been followed, weeks later, by a single, brief, almost bureaucratic transmission from human space, addressed not to the aggressor's government, but to every neighboring power capable of receiving it, stating simply that the matter had been resolved, and that further inquiries would not be answered. No fleet had ever asked a second time. I sat with that file for a long time before the recess ended, and when I returned to the chamber, I found myself watching General Kess differently than I had an hour before. Not as a representative of a young, isolated species pleading for mercy at a table built for older, wiser powers. I watched her instead as something else entirely, though I did not yet have the right word for what that something else was. I would find the word soon enough. Every species in this quadrant would. The recess that followed was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted closer to 3, because the compact's senior command, watching the session from a secure relay elsewhere on the station, had requested an emergency briefing on exactly what General Kess's warning might mean. I was pulled into that briefing not because anyone valued my opinion, but because I happened to be the only observer in the building who had already gone looking for answers before being told to. What I learned in those 3 hours reshaped everything I thought I understood about the last 6 months of compact and human relations, and I will try to lay it out as clearly as I can, because the details matter more than the drama. 6 months before the talks at Corvan Reach, following the first border incursion, the compact had expected humanity to respond the way every young species responds to a demonstrated threat from a larger power. We expected fear. We expected humanity to spend those 6 months building visible defenses along its frontier, moving fleets into obvious formations, requesting emergency alliances with any nearby power willing to lend support, the standard behavior of a species trying to look stronger than it is. Instead, humanity's frontier had gone quiet, not undefended, not abandoned, simply quiet, in a way that compact intelligence analysts had initially read as a good sign, evidence that humanity did not intend to escalate, and was perhaps hoping the matter would resolve itself through the talks. Fleet movements along the border had actually decreased. Colony populations near the frontier had, if anything, grown slightly. Families relocating toward the edge of human space rather than away from it, which every analyst in the room agreed made no sense for a species bracing for war. It was Colonel Thorne's counterpart on the intelligence side, a junior officer whose name I never learned because it never appeared in any record I was shown, who apparently first raised the possibility that the quiet was not disorganization or hesitation. It was construction, and whatever was being constructed had been designed, deliberately and carefully, not to look like a threat. I want to explain what this means, because it is the heart of everything that followed. Every species in the compact builds weapons the way its ancestors built weapons, shaped by the wars it has already fought. Our fleets carry heavy plating and long-range batteries because our ancestral conflicts were fought between slow, well-defended battle lines that traded blows across enormous distances until one side's defenses failed first. Every scanning system the compact has ever developed is tuned to recognize that pattern: plating density, battery heat signatures, shield harmonics, because that is what a weapon has always looked like to us. Humanity had spent 6 months building something that did not match any of those patterns, and so, for 6 months, we had looked directly at it, without recognizing what we were seeing. The clearest piece of evidence came from a routine trade survey conducted near a human system called Aldergate, a mid-sized colony sitting almost exactly on the frontier line the compact intended to claim under its new terms. The survey, conducted by a neutral merchant guild with no political stake in the outcome, had noted unusually heavy freight traffic moving into Aldergate's outer shipyards over the previous 4 months, far more than the colony's population or industrial output could reasonably explain. The guild's report had flagged this as an anomaly worth mentioning, then moved on, because the freight itself carried no obvious military signature, no weapons housings, no shield generators, no hull plating in the quantities you would expect for fleet construction. What the freight manifests did show, once someone finally cross-referenced them against known human industrial patterns, was an enormous quantity of small, modular, highly adaptable components, the kind of parts that on their own could belong to almost anything. Sensor arrays sized for close-range precision rather than long-distance detection. Propulsion units built for rapid directional changes rather than sustained straight-line speed. Communication relays designed to operate in tight, coordinated clusters rather than broadcasting across a single large formation. None of it looked like a fleet. All of it, once assembled, apparently became something else entirely, something the briefing officers struggled to even categorize, because it did not resemble any weapon system in the compact's extensive archive of enemy technology. I asked, during that briefing, the question that seemed most obvious to me and that no one else in the room had thought to ask aloud. If humanity had spent 6 months quietly building something new rather than reinforcing its existing defenses, what had convinced them that talks would fail badly enough to justify the effort, months before General Kess ever stood up and said the words herself? The answer, when it came, unsettled the room more than the freight manifests had. Humanity had not built this in response to the possibility that talks would fail. Humanity had built this because their own historical pattern, the same 4 vanished incursion fleets Kess had referenced in the chamber, had taught them that talks with a numerically superior power, that believed itself entitled to dictate terms, almost always failed eventually, regardless of how those talks began. They had not been reacting to this specific negotiation. They had been preparing, patiently and quietly, for the next time any power decided humanity's isolation made it an acceptable target, because history had already told them that day was coming, sooner or later, in one form or another. They had simply chosen this time to be ready before the day arrived instead of after. I left that briefing with a feeling I did not have a word for yet, something between admiration and dread, and I do not think I was the only one. The senior command that had called the emergency session spent its final hour arguing not about whether to continue the talks, but about whether to continue them at all, or whether the safer course was to withdraw the ultimatum entirely and quietly abandon the frontier claim before General Kess returned to the chamber and said whatever she had clearly already decided to say. High Speaker Doran Vell overruled that suggestion. I understand in hindsight why he did. 80 years of compact expansion had been built on a simple, unbroken rule, that no species negotiates from strength against the compact and wins, because the compact's numbers alone had always been enough to make any opponent reconsider before matters escalated too far. To withdraw the ultimatum now, in response to an unverified threat and a stack of freight manifests no one could fully explain, would have been to admit, publicly, that the rule no longer held, and an empire built on that rule cannot survive admitting, even once, that the rule has an exception. So the terms stayed on the table. The session was called back into order, and I returned to the chamber carrying knowledge that none of the other observers around me possessed, watching General Kess walk back to her seat with the same unhurried calm she had carried in that first moment, and understanding now, in a way I had not an hour earlier, that the calm was not confidence borrowed from ignorance of the odds. It was confidence built on knowing exactly what the odds actually were, and having already decided she did not need them to favor her the way the compact assumed they always would. I remember thinking, as the final session began, that somewhere out past the frontier, in the quiet shipyards of a colony called Aldergate, something humanity had spent 6 patient months assembling was already waiting, finished, tested, and ready, for a war that the people building it had never wanted, but had refused to be caught unprepared for. I did not know yet what that something was, neither did anyone else in that chamber, on either side of the table, except the small handful of humans who had helped design it. But I understood, sitting there, that whatever it was, it had not been built to lose. The final session opened without ceremony. There was no restatement of terms, no formal welcome, only High Speaker Doran Vell taking his seat, and beginning, immediately, with the sentence that would end any possibility of peace before it finished leaving his mouth. He said that the compact had reviewed General Kess's warning and found it, in his words, an interesting piece of theater unsupported by any evidence the compact considered credible. He said the terms remained unchanged, and that if humanity refused to accept them by the end of this session, the compact would consider the refusal an act of open hostility, triggering full mobilization along the frontier, and the immediate deployment of compact forces to secure human territory by whatever means became necessary. He said this not as a threat but as a formality, the way a judge reads a sentence that has already been decided, because in 80 years no species had ever called that particular bluff and survived the attempt. I watched Colonel Thorne's face while the High Speaker spoke, and for the first time since the session began, I saw something other than restraint there. It was not fear, it was closer to grief, the particular kind of grief a person carries when they already know exactly what is about to happen and have simply been hoping, against their own better judgment, that it might somehow be avoided anyway. General Kess did not share that expression. She listened to the entire ultimatum without interrupting, without shifting in her seat, without any visible reaction at all, and when the High Speaker finished and the chamber fell silent waiting for her answer, she let that silence sit for a long moment before she finally spoke. She said that humanity had come to Corvan Reach in good faith, willing to discuss any reasonable resolution to the border dispute that did not require surrendering territory that had been settled, built, and defended entirely by human effort, without compact assistance and without compact permission. She said that the terms offered were not a resolution, they were a demand for submission dressed in the language of peace, and that humanity had learned, across 80 years of watching other species accept exactly these kinds of terms from exactly this kind of power, that submission offered once is never offered only once. It is asked for again, a little more each time, until there is nothing left to submit. She said that humanity would not be the 12th species to learn that lesson the slow way. The High Speaker began to respond, something about the compact's long history of fair dealing with cooperative partners, but General Kess raised one hand, not sharply, not as a challenge, simply the small, unmistakable gesture of someone who has decided the conversation is finished and does not require permission to end it. And the strange thing, the thing I have never fully been able to explain to anyone who was not in that room, is that the High Speaker actually stopped talking. 11 species were represented in that chamber. Every translator in the room had gone quiet. And somehow this single human general, commanding a fraction of the military strength seated across from her, had just silenced the most powerful diplomatic body in the quadrant with the movement of one hand. She stood. She did not raise her voice. She said the words slowly, the way a person closes a door they do not intend to open again. No more talks, let the war begin. I want to describe what happened in the chamber in the seconds after she said it, because I think it says more about the difference between our two ways of understanding conflict than anything that came before. The compact delegates reacted the way we always react to a declared threat from a smaller power, with a kind of practiced, almost bored confidence, murmurs passing between advisors already calculating fleet deployment timelines, already treating the sentence as the opening move of a negotiation rather than the closing of one. Several delegates actually smiled. I remember one leaning toward a colleague and saying quietly that this was, in his opinion, exactly the kind of dramatic gesture young species make when they have run out of real arguments. The humans did not react at all. Colonel Thorne stood when Kess stood, and the other two members of the delegation rose with him, and together the four of them walked toward the chamber's main exit without another word, without looking back at the table they were leaving, without any of the ceremony that usually accompanies the collapse of a negotiation this significant. It was, I realized watching them go, not a dramatic gesture. It was simply the end of a task they no longer had any reason to continue performing. High Speaker Vell called after them, something about consequences, something about the compact not forgetting insolence of this kind, and General Kess paused at the door just long enough to answer him, and it was this final exchange, more than the sentence that gave the war its name, that I have never been able to stop thinking about. She said that the compact was welcome to remember whatever it liked. What mattered now was whether the compact would still exist in its current form long enough to do the remembering. Then the door closed, and the four of them were gone, and the chamber erupted into the kind of noise that happens when a room full of people who have never lost suddenly realize they do not know what happens next. I left the station that night aboard a compact courier vessel, carrying the full transcript of the session back to Fleet Command, along with a private report of my own, one that included the freight manifests from Aldergate, the history of the 4 vanished incursion fleets, and every piece of evidence I had gathered suggesting that humanity's confidence in that chamber had not been bluster. My report was filed, acknowledged, and, as far as I could tell, almost entirely ignored. Fleet Command had already begun drafting mobilization orders before my transmission even arrived. Over-Commander Rascaloon, who would lead the first strike against human territory, was said to have read the transcript of Kess's final words and laughed, telling his staff that a species without allies making threats it could not possibly back up was the easiest kind of enemy to punish, because there would be no one left to complain on their behalf once the punishment was delivered. I think of that laugh often now. I think of how certain he sounded, how reasonable his confidence must have felt to everyone in that briefing room, built as it was on 80 years of unbroken precedent, and every lesson the Compact had ever learned about how wars against smaller powers were supposed to go. 3 days later, Over-Commander Rascaloon's fleet reached the human colony of Aldergate, the quiet frontier world where, unknown to any of us, humanity had spent 6 patient months finishing the thing that would make his laughter the last confident sound anyone in Compact Command would make for a very long time. I was not supposed to be aboard the strike fleet. Observers are typically kept away from active engagements, held back at a safe relay point until the outcome is settled and only the tidy version of events needs to be recorded. But the Compact's leadership wanted a full account of what they expected to be a swift, decisive lesson delivered to Aldergate, something they could show to every other frontier species, still considering whether human-style defiance might be worth attempting. So I was placed aboard an observation cruiser trailing behind Over-Commander Iloon's main formation, close enough to witness everything, far enough, they believed, to remain safe no matter what happened. The fleet that approached Aldergate was, by every measure the Compact had ever used to judge strength, overwhelming. 42 vessels, ranging from light escorts to 2 of the heaviest battle carriers in the Eastern Fleet, more firepower than had ever been required to subdue a single frontier colony in the Compact's recorded history. Over-Commander Iloon did not expect resistance so much as he expected a formality. A brief show of defiance followed by the inevitable surrender once Aldergate's defenders understood exactly what they were facing. Aldergate's own defenses, visible on our long-range scans as we approached, appeared almost laughably modest. A handful of orbital platforms, a defense fleet of perhaps a dozen vessels, small and lightly armed by Compact standards, arranged in a loose formation that our tactical officers described, without any apparent concern, as amateur. I remember one of the cruiser's junior officers remarking that it was almost a shame that a colony this poorly defended did not deserve the honor of being the first target in a war that would define the next century of Compact history. The fleet began its approach maneuver, the standard opening formation the Compact had used successfully against dozens of smaller powers before, a wide encircling sweep meant to cut off any retreat while the heavy carriers moved into firing position at the center. It was, Over-Commander Iloon's staff later admitted, a formation chosen specifically because it had never once failed. It failed within 4 minutes. I want to describe what happened as clearly as I can, because even now, having reviewed the full engagement data dozens of times since, I do not fully understand every detail of what humanity had built. What I understood then, watching from the observation cruiser, was that Aldergate's dozen visible defense vessels were never the actual defense at all. They were bait, arranged loosely enough to look unprepared, positioned specifically to draw the Compact fleet into the wide encircling formation that would put our own ships closest to the colony's outer shipyards, the same shipyards that had spent 6 months quietly assembling something our sensors had never learned to recognize. The moment the Compact fleet completed its encircling maneuver, dozens of small, previously undetected vessels emerged from concealment along Aldergate's outer defense ring. Vessels built from exactly the kind of modular, close-range, rapidly maneuverable components I had read about in that emergency briefing 3 days earlier. They did not resemble anything in the Compact's archive of known weapons platforms, and for the first several seconds of the engagement, our own tactical systems genuinely could not classify them as hostile at all, because nothing in 80 years of accumulated threat data matched their profile. By the time our systems adjusted their classification, it was already too late to matter. I will not describe the specific tactics in detail, both because much of what I understood of them remains difficult to explain in terms that make sense outside a military context, and because I do not believe the details are the point of this account. What matters is the shape of what happened rather than its mechanics. where the compact fleet had been built to fight slow, heavily armored battles of attrition, trading blows across long distances until one side's defenses gave out first. Aldergate's hidden defenders had been built to do the opposite entirely. They moved fast, in tight coordinated clusters, striking at specific vulnerable points in the compact formation rather than engaging its strength directly, disabling propulsion and coordination systems rather than attempting to overpower shields that had been designed, across generations, to withstand exactly the kind of sustained heavy fire the compact fleet was prepared to deliver. Within the first hour, the wide encircling formation that had never failed the compact before had completely collapsed. Vessels that had begun the engagement in careful coordinated positions found themselves isolated, unable to communicate effectively with the rest of the fleet, unable to bring their heavier weapons to bear against targets too fast and too well coordinated to stay within the firing arcs those weapons had been designed for. Overcommander Elun's flagship, the pride of the Eastern Fleet, spent the better part of that first hour attempting to re-establish a coherent formation among ships that could no longer reliably coordinate with each other, while Aldergate's defenders continued to systematically strip away the fleet's ability to fight as a unified force, rather than as 42 increasingly isolated targets. I remember, more than anything else from that hour, the silence aboard the observation cruiser. Officers who had spent the approach making confident remarks about the coming formality now stood watching their displays without speaking at all, because there was nothing in their training that had prepared them for a battle unfolding this way. The compact had built its entire military doctrine around a single assumption, that overwhelming numbers and heavier defenses would always, eventually, win a war of attrition against a smaller opponent, given enough time and enough patience. Aldergate's defenders had simply refused to fight the war of attrition at all. They had built something specifically designed to make sure that war never happened, replacing it instead with something faster, more precise, and far harder to counter, because it did not follow any pattern the compact's long history had ever taught it to expect. By the end of the second hour, Overcommander Elun gave the order to withdraw what remained of the fleet. It was, I later learned, the first time in the recorded history of the compact's expansion that a fleet commander had ordered a full retreat from an engagement against a colony that fielded no capital ships larger than a light cruiser. 18 of the original 42 vessels made it back across the frontier under their own power. The rest were disabled, captured, or lost entirely, and Aldergate's defenders, remarkably, made no attempt to pursue the retreating fleet beyond the edge of their own territory, a restraint that struck me, at the time, as almost more unsettling than the battle itself. They had not fought to destroy us. They had fought only to make absolutely certain we could not stay. I transmitted my observation report back to Compact Command that night, describing everything I had witnessed as precisely as I could manage, though I knew, even as I wrote it, that no report could fully capture what it had felt like to watch 80 years of unbroken military doctrine collapse in the span of 2 hours against a colony we had entered expecting to encounter nothing more than a formality. I did not yet know that Aldergate had been only the beginning, a single frontier colony demonstrating a fraction of what 6 months of quiet, patient preparation had built. I did not yet know how many other colonies along that frontier had spent those same 6 months preparing something similar, waiting for a war they had hoped would never come but had refused to be caught unprepared for when it finally did. I only knew, watching the wreckage of Overcommander Elun's proud fleet limp back across the border that night, that General Marquez had not been bluffing in that chamber 3 days earlier, and that the compact's 80 years of unbroken precedent had just ended, quietly and completely, above the orbital shipyards of a colony most of us had never even heard of before that morning. The weeks that followed Aldergate unfolded in a way that no one in Compact Command had prepared for, because every contingency plan the Compact had ever drafted assumed that a defeated fleet meant a wounded enemy retreating to rebuild, buying time, seeking allies, doing what every smaller power had always done after a costly loss. Humanity did none of that. Instead of retreating to rebuild, human forces began advancing along the frontier, methodically and without haste, reclaiming disputed territory the Compact had occupied over the previous 6 months and, in several cases, pushing beyond it into border regions that had never been seriously contested before. I was recalled from the observation cruiser shortly after the Aldergate engagement, brought back to serve on a hastily assembled analysis team, tasked with understanding exactly what the Compact had failed to see, and it was during those weeks that I finally understood the true shape of what General Kess had meant by her warning in that chamber. Humanity had not built a single decisive weapon capable of ending the war in one stroke. What they had built, patiently and across every colony along that vulnerable frontier, was a doctrine, an entirely different way of preparing for conflict that the Compact had never encountered, because every previous opponent had eventually adopted some version of the Compact's own methods: heavy armor, long-range engagement, overwhelming numbers, simply because those methods had always worked before. Humanity had looked at that pattern, understood exactly how it worked, and built something specifically designed to make it fail. Fast, adaptable, difficult to classify, and coordinated with a precision that came not from superior technology alone, but from a species that had spent 80 years learning to survive without anyone else's help, and had used that isolation to become extraordinarily good at solving problems entirely on its own terms. The Compact's senior leadership, faced with mounting losses along the frontier and no clear path to reversing them, requested a second round of talks within a month of Aldergate. I was present for that request being drafted, and I remember the particular quiet that settled over the room when someone finally said, out loud, what everyone had already been thinking: humanity would very likely refuse. General Kess had told them plainly, in front of 11 species, that talks were over, and every report coming back from the frontier suggested that humanity had meant exactly what it said, continuing to press its advantage rather than pausing to negotiate from a position of strength, the way the Compact itself would almost certainly have done in their place. They were right to expect the refusal. The formal request for renewed talks was returned within days, not rejected outright, but answered instead with a short, unadorned message from Human Command, stating that humanity remained willing to discuss a lasting peace once the Compact's forces had withdrawn entirely from all disputed territory and formally acknowledged human sovereignty over the frontier colonies in question. No punitive terms were attached, no demand for reparations, no request for Compact territory in exchange for the losses at Aldergate. Only a plain, almost anticlimactic insistence that the war would end the moment the Compact stopped trying to take what was not theirs. It took the Compact 11 more months to accept those terms, months during which the frontier continued to shift steadily in humanity's favor, not through any single overwhelming victory but through a slow, grinding accumulation of small losses that eventually made continuing the war more costly than accepting the peace humanity had offered from the very beginning. I sat in on the final session myself, the one where the Compact's new High Speaker, Doran Vell, having been quietly removed from his post months earlier, formally accepted terms that were, in every meaningful way, identical to what had been available before the first shot was ever fired. General Kess was present for that final session as well, though she said very little this time. She did not need to. The war itself had already said everything that needed saying, more clearly and more permanently than any speech could have managed. I have spent the years since that final session trying to understand what I actually witnessed, and I think I have finally arrived at something close to an answer, though it took me far longer than it should have. The mistake the Compact made was not underestimating human weapons, or human tactics, or even human resolve, though we underestimated all three. The deeper mistake was assuming that a species without allies must be a species defined by its lack, when in truth humanity's isolation had never been a weakness at all. It had been the exact circumstance that forced them to become extraordinarily capable of solving their own problems, on their own terms, without waiting for anyone else's permission or protection. We assumed that patience meant hesitation. It meant preparation. We assumed that quiet meant weakness. It meant a species choosing, deliberately, not to show its hand until showing it would matter most. And we assumed that a calm voice delivering an ultimatum was a bluff, because in 80 years, no one had ever called our bluffs and meant it. General Mara Kess meant every word. I still think, sometimes, about that first moment in the chamber at Corvin Reach, watching her walk in without ceremony, without decoration, studying the exits and the ceiling supports the way someone studies a room they intend to remember, rather than a room they intend to fear. I understand now what I did not understand then. She was never afraid of that room, because she had already spent months preparing for exactly what would happen if the people inside it refused to listen. The talks were never truly a negotiation from her perspective. They were a formality, a final courtesy extended to a power that did not deserve one, offered mostly so that history would show, clearly and without argument, exactly who had chosen war when peace was still available. The Compact remembers General Kess now, in every strategic briefing given to every officer who might one day find themselves facing a human fleet. We remember her not as a villain, though some in the Compact still insist on that framing, and not as a hero, though I have come to believe she deserves that title more than most who wear it. We remember her, plainly and without embellishment, as a warning, the clearest lesson our long history has ever produced about the danger of mistaking someone's silence for the absence of strength. Never mistake a human's patience for hesitation. Never mistake their calm for uncertainty. And whatever you do, in whatever chamber, on whatever station, across whatever negotiating table you find yourself facing them, never make a human general say that sentence twice. 10 years passed before I saw General Kess again, and by then I no longer served the compact in any official capacity. I had resigned my post not long after the peace was signed, unable to reconcile the version of the galaxy I had believed in with the one I had actually witnessed, and I had taken instead a quiet position teaching strategic history at a small academy on a neutral world called Varen Station, far from any frontier, where students came from a dozen different species to study the wars that had shaped the quadrant they would one day help govern. She came to Varen Station not as a general but as a private citizen, though I do not think someone like Mara Kess ever fully stops being a general, in the same way a river does not stop being a river simply because it has reached calmer water. She had been invited to speak to a graduating class about the Aldergate campaign, a lecture the Academy's board had debated for months before finally extending the invitation, uncertain whether inviting the architect of the compact's greatest military humiliation was wisdom or provocation. I was asked to introduce her, largely because I was the only member of the faculty who had actually been present in that chamber at Corvan Reach, and because the board believed, correctly, that my account would carry a weight no second-hand summary could match. I met her the evening before the lecture, in a small reception room overlooking the station's central garden, and I confess I had spent most of the preceding decade building her into something larger than a person in my own memory, a symbol rather than a woman, and I was almost surprised to find, sitting across from me, someone who laughed easily, asked genuine questions about my students, and seemed far more interested in discussing the Academy's curriculum than in reliving the war that had made her famous across a dozen star systems. I asked her, eventually, the question I had carried for 10 years without ever having the chance to ask it directly. I asked whether she had known, standing in that chamber, exactly what would happen if the compact refused her terms, whether the confidence I had watched that day had been certainty or simply a very good performance of it. She considered the question longer than I expected before answering. She said that no commander, human or otherwise, ever walks into a war with true certainty of its outcome, and that anyone who claims otherwise afterward is usually rewriting their own memory to sound wiser than they actually were in the moment. What she had carried into that chamber was not certainty of victory, it was certainty of preparation. She had known exactly what humanity had built, exactly what it was capable of, and exactly what it would cost if the compact forced the matter to a military conclusion. What she had not known, and could not have known, was whether the compact would actually be foolish enough to test it, rather than accept the peace being offered. She said the tragedy of the war, if it had one, was not that humanity had won it, it was that the war had been entirely avoidable, and that 80 years of compact expansion had built a system so confident in its own inevitability that it could not recognize the moment it should have simply listened instead of dictating. I told her that evening about the emergency briefing I had attended during the recess at Corvan Reach, about the freight manifests and the 4 vanished incursion fleets, and the quiet dread that had settled over the room once the compact's own analysts realized how badly we had misjudged what patience actually looked like on a human timescale. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me since, something I have repeated to every graduating class I have taught in the years after her visit. She said that every species measures strength by the tools it has needed to survive its own history, and that the compact had built an empire out of never needing to be patient, because its numbers had always been large enough to make patience unnecessary. Humanity had built its survival out of exactly the opposite condition, alone, unprotected, forced across generations to solve every problem slowly and thoroughly before it became a crisis, because there had never been anyone else to solve it for them. The war at Aldergate had not been a demonstration of superior weapons. It had been a demonstration of what an entire species can build when patience is not a virtue it practices occasionally, but a discipline it has never had the luxury of abandoning. The lecture she gave the following morning drew students from every corner of the academy, far more than the hall had been built to hold, and I watched from the back of the room as she walked them through the Aldergate campaign, not as a story of triumph, but as a case study in failed assumptions, careful to spend as much time examining the compact's mistakes as she spent explaining humanity's preparation. She told the students, many of whom would go on to serve their own governments in exactly the kinds of negotiating chambers I had once served in, that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not the moment the fighting begins, it is the moment before that, the quiet stretch where one side assumes it already understands the other well enough to stop asking questions. She left Varen Station 2 days later, and I did not see her again, though I followed her career from a distance in the years that remained to her, watching her step back from active command gradually, taking on the kind of advisory roles that senior officers take when the wars they were built for have finally, mercifully, become less frequent. Humanity's frontier grew quieter after Aldergate, not because every neighboring power had learned to respect it outright, but because word travels quickly between species who share a border with a power capable of doing what humanity had done, and few governments, however proud, are eager to be the next case study taught in a lecture hall on a neutral station somewhere between the stars. I think often about what might have happened if the Compact had listened in that chamber, if High Speaker Doran Vell had taken General Kess's first warning seriously, instead of dismissing it as theater from a species he still, even then, could not quite bring himself to consider an equal. I do not believe the peace that eventually followed the war would have looked very different from the peace that could have been reached that very first day, before Aldergate, before the 18 ships that limped home, before the months of grinding losses that finally taught the Compact what a single careful reading of the evidence should have taught it from the start. The terms humanity accepted at the end of the war were, after all, almost exactly the terms they had offered before it began. The only thing the war had actually changed was how many lives it cost the Compact to finally believe them. That, I have come to understand, is the true lesson buried inside everything that happened at Corven Reach and Aldergate, and every quiet frontier colony that spent 6 patient months preparing for a fight it hoped would never come. It is not a lesson about human strength, though humanity is, without question, far stronger than the galaxy gave it credit for being. It is a lesson about listening, about the particular danger of believing your own history so completely that you stop being able to hear a warning clearly delivered, in plain language, by someone who has already decided exactly how far they are willing to be pushed. I teach that lesson now to every class that passes through my doors, students from a dozen species who will one day sit across tables from powers they do not yet fully understand, and I tell them, every year, the same thing I have come to believe more firmly with each passing year since that day in the chamber. Watch the quiet ones, listen when they tell you they are done talking, and whatever you do, do not mistake the absence of noise for the absence of strength, because somewhere behind that silence, a species that has survived on nothing but its own patience and preparation may already have finished building exactly what it needs to prove you wrong.